Good evening, everyone. Hello, Frome. So, great pleasure to welcome to Frome Rob Hopkins, who spoke here 10 years ago, something? Long time ago. A lot of things have happened here in Frome since then. I've moved here for one thing, but a lot of other really cool things, which are great because I don't have to organise them, like even this event, which has been great. And the reason that Anna Francis, who has been the co-organiser of this event with me from the Town Council, is not here is because she's on her way back from Berlin, receiving an award. Frome received an award for the community fridge. So this is it was the first community fridge, of which there are now apparently 60 community fridges around the country. So she was there on our behalf receiving an award, so that's why she's not here. To welcome Frome to Rob Hopkins.
Hello, good evening. Thank you so much for coming out on this evening. Always lovely to come to Frome. It's like sort of, feels like Totnes' sort of kind of weird sister. Yeah, she said that, not me. So thank you so much for coming. So this evening is an evening which is a kind of a celebration of the imagination. I'd like to think of this evening as being a kind of an extended love poem to two words, what if, which feel to me like the most important words in our vocabulary in 2019. And this is not going to be an evening where you're just going to sit there and listen to me speak for the whole time. I'm going to be getting you to do things as well. This is kind of part talk, part workshop, bit kind of interactive. And in order for that stuff to work, I need to teach you one very simple piece of transition technology, which is that if you see me put my hand up, you put your hand up too and you stop talking. Okay, quick practice. Just very good. Okay, just the one hand, yeah, and then you stop talking. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to do requires you to make a pair with somebody that you didn't know before you came here this evening. So you might need to just turn around, or you might even need to get up and swap with the person on the other side of the aisle. Introduce yourself, find a partner. Okay? Very good, very good, very good. Thank you. Has everybody got somebody? Is everybody in a partner? You don't have a partner? You do have a partner. Oh, you know everyone. Oh, okay. All right, so for this exercise, you are going to have 1.5 minutes with your partner, and I'm going to show you an object. And with your partner, you have 1.5 minutes to think of as many alternative uses for that object as you can, all right? They don't have to be sensible. You don't have to be thinking this is like school and I have some right answer in my head that you're trying to get at, that you're trying to guess. This is just throw out as many different ideas as you possibly can. You don't have to write them down, but just keep a loose count of how many ideas you come up with, okay? Is that clear? Okay, so you have 1.5 minutes and your object is my shoe. Go. Okay, you're very good at this. Thank you very much. So, put your hands up if you thought of more than 5, more than 10, more than 15, more than 20. Very good, okay. Were there any that you thought of that you thought, that is genius, that's so brilliant. I really hope he asks us to share any really great ideas that we came up with. Yes? Nail it to a tree. And the bird might make its nest in it. Thank you very much. Another shoe? What do you mean? How do you mean another shoe?
For a child.
Oh, you could make other shoes out of that shoe. Oh, I see. Yeah, thank you. Great.
You need to drill a hole in the bottom of it so the water drains out for the nest box. That's what you thought.
Oh, okay. So you need to drill a hole in the bottom so the water can drain out of the nest box. They're way ahead of you on the nest box thing. Yeah? They're designing drainage and everything. Yes? A gimp mask for a giraffe. Thank you. I think. Yes. You got the permaculturists are in, you can spot them a mile off. Use it as a damp-proof course for a timber frame building. Yes?
Oh, it's a boat for fairies.
A boat for fairies. Very good, thank you.
You can play cat's cradle with the shoelaces.
You could play cat's cradle with the shoelaces, very nice.
We were going to put our beer on it if we were sitting on a slope outside.
Ah, very nice. A sort of sloped ground beer holder. Very nice. Yes? A meditation cushion. Really? Okay. Okay. Okay, I did this recently and someone said you could do it for the most boring sort of health and safety conscious version of Conkers. And I often do this with a paper coffee cup. And I did it in Sweden one time, and this woman said, I would use it to keep the darkness in. Which troubled me for quite a while. And then somebody pointed out that in Sweden there's a whole month where it's light all the time, and it might be actually quite nice to have a little bit of darkness in the house. You could just go and have a little look in it just to remind yourself what the darkness. I felt a lot better about things. So thank you very much for doing that. So the reason I like to start doing that exercise is that when you do that, and when I look around the room when you're doing that exercise, this room fills up with imagination. And you're all connected to the other person, there's kind of laughter, your eyes are bright, there's a connection there, you're trying to solve something or think through something where there's no right answer. And you're doing it as part of lots of other people who are also trying to think through the same thing. And for me, if we're going to succeed in the next 10 or 15 years, it needs to feel like that. Not like a kind of long walk home in the rain on a cold Thursday afternoon. You know, this needs to feel kind of alive and celebratory and imagination rich. And that's really what I want to talk about. So thank you for doing that with me. And I just want to start with a quote by Susan Griffin. She said, "One might say that human societies have two boundaries. One boundary is drawn by the requirements of the natural world, and the other by the collective imagination." So, where's my clever thing? Oh, here we go. So, I want to start by showing you a picture of my wife being arrested by the police. For the fourth time, I think. I think it's really important to acknowledge that the last year, it feels like finally to me, like the tectonic plates deep under our feet are finally starting to shift. And partly due to Extinction Rebellion, partly due to the school strikes, partly due to lots of work that many people here have been doing over a long period of time. But it feels like finally things are starting to move in a way that I find really, really delightful. And a while ago I went to Westminster for the climate strike. The global strike for climate, where it was, I went up to Westminster. There was about 100,000 people, mostly young people, surrounding Westminster. It was just glorious. There was such a passion and an energy and it was wonderful. And when I was there, I felt like, what if this day here, standing in Westminster, was the day that we look back to as being the tipping point? Because a tipping point you only see in your rear view mirror once you've gone past it. You don't recognise it when you're living through the time of a tipping point. But it feels to me in many ways like that's kind of where we're at. And I'm only going to show you one graph, don't worry, and don't look at it for the numbers. I'm showing it for you for the story as much as anything. But it feels to me like, you know, we've spent ages getting up to this point here where we are at the top, and the task ahead of us is huge. And in the transition movement, we've always felt that actually the only way that's going to happen is if we can tell stories about the bottom half of that graph that are so delicious and so enticing that they create such a deep, deep longing to get there. For me, this is all about longing. How do we create a longing for a low carbon world in such a way that anything else, why on earth would we really want to do that? But the thing that struck me when I was there at Westminster was that actually most of our experience of working around climate change for years and years, many people here, has been like trying to push a broken down car up that hill. It's exhausting. You're pushing against the kind of wider trends in the society and the media. You're pushing against the whole culture, all the narratives and everything. So it's really, really hard work. I feel at the moment like we are rocking on the top of that. And it's really important that we allow ourselves to imagine, what would it be like to be on the other side of that hill? What would it be like to be on the downward side of that? When things start to line up and finance and policy making and everything lines up and gets behind making this happen, it would feel like something we've never felt before. But we have to kind of make the space in our imagination for that, I think. And that's kind of what I would like to kind of open up the possibility of this evening. Which leads me into my second thing that I would like you to do with me, which would require you to find a different person that you didn't speak to before. So you might turn the other way, you might turn around, find somebody ideally who's a partner who, if possible, you can kind of just move your chairs slightly, or some way that you can face in towards each other would be wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so what we are going to attempt this evening, and if this doesn't make the front page of the local newspaper here, I'm going to be really surprised. We are going to attempt the first act of mass time travel in the history of Frome. And you're all here this evening. This is something you'll tell your grandchildren about, this whole thing. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to travel forward in time to 2030. And in order to do that, we have to use a time machine, and the time machine has a particular sound. When you turn on the time machine, there's a particular way that it sounds, okay, which requires you to join in with what this sounds like, okay? It sounds like this. Beautiful. That is a very good Frome time machine. So when we turn on our time machine, that's what it's going to sound like, okay? So if I could invite you to close your eyes and kind of lean in, if you can, towards the person who is your partner. And when we turn on this time machine, we're going to travel forward to 2030. And those 11 years between now and 2030 were the time of the most phenomenal social transition in this country. We saw the unlocking of policy making, everything lined up. Communities were mobilised and resourced to do everything that needed to happen. And you're going to travel forward to a 2030 that has achieved being a zero carbon country. Okay? And when we travel, I'm going to just invite you to imagine that you travel forward, and then we're just going to wait. We're going to spend a minute or two with you just exploring that, using your imagination, but in a multi-sensory way. What does it smell like? What does it sound like? What do you hear? What do you see? Walking around Frome in 2030, when we've achieved net zero in this country. Okay? So let's turn on our time machine, and as we travel forward, you might feel the wind passing over your face as you travel forward through time to that time. Okay? Could I gently coax you back to 2019? Thank you. I wonder if anybody has any reflection or anything they'd like to share about that?
It was all positive. Although, if I really search, I could probably find something that might be a negative. But initially, it all seemed
positive.
Yeah.
Thank you.
After free energy has been revealed, there will be no competition, and people will be much more interested in helping each other.
Thank you.
Seeing people dancing with each other in the street.
Doesn't that happen anyway in Frome all the time? Is it? Thank you. Yes? Great. Can you hear? Okay. She said there'll be more community and people working more closely together and building a stronger sense of community. Maybe if you stand up so that people can hear when you... Yeah?
0-hour contracts will be abolished.
Yay.
No more homeless people, no more people having to sell big issue, because everyone will be housed in decent, housing.
Great, thank you.
You can hear more birds.
You can hear more birds? Yeah, thank you.
You'll have less military airplanes flying overhead because we've been making peace around the world instead of war.
Fantastic. So thank you so much for doing that and going on that little journey. I've done this event, this exercise with lots of different groups, big, small. I did this in a room with 1,500 people in Brussels a few weeks ago. You could have heard a pin drop. It was absolutely beautiful. And birdsong is usually the first thing that people talk about. So, and I did it a while ago. There was a woman there who worked for years as a climate change activist, and she said, I realised doing this exercise that I've never stopped to imagine the world that I'm working for. I've been working for this for 20 years, and I've never really stopped to try and really kind of gain it, to sort of shape it in my head. She said this should be like a daily practice. And what I hope as we go forward, I'm be trying to get across is that actually this should be something that we weave into all of the narratives that we do. So, thank you so much for doing that. So, this is a guy in Leeds called James Mackay, who I talk about in the book, who's an artist who draws the future. And a lot of people draw the future in a way that's really kind of a bit obvious. He draws it in a way that I find really beautiful because it's really believable. It looks like now, but it's like now if we did everything we could possibly do. This is what a city would look like if it was the most biodiverse a city could possibly be. This is his idea of what a city could look like if food grew absolutely everywhere. Once we get the cars out of our city, as is rapidly happening in many places, we have an awful lot of space. 2/3 of the surface area of Los Angeles is dedicated to the car. Once we start to move beyond the car, that's an awful lot of space. In Paris already, the amount of cars going into Paris is falling to the degree that there's a whole load of underground car parks that are surplus to requirement. And last couple of years ago, the mayor of Paris ran a competition to come up with creative uses for these car parks, and they're now filling up with mushrooms being grown and salads and all sorts of stuff being grown in these car parks. Wine, cheese, all sorts of stuff. It's fantastic. Very French solution to a problem. So sometimes people sort of say, well, yeah, Rob, this is all very nice, but it's a bit like pie in the sky, Rob, fantasy stuff. You know, part of the lovely thing about what I do is I get to go around and visit transition groups all over the place who are already doing this stuff. And they're not waiting for anyone's permission, they're just getting on with it. Last year I went to a place called Montsartou, which is a small town north of Nice, in the south of France. And in Montsartou, a few years ago, the French government said 20% of all school meals should be organic. And in Montsartou they said, well, if 20% is better than 0%, why are we stopping at 20%? Surely we should just go all the way to 100%. So in Montsartou, in all the schools, the food is 100% organic, and 70% of that food comes from a market garden on the edge of the town, which was set up by the municipality. They bought this land, it was going to be built with houses, and they turned it into this market garden, which is just beautiful and full of flowers and bees and butterflies and just wonderful. They have loads of different polytunnels. They grow the biggest chard I've ever seen in my life. You could wear it. You sort of stitched two bits of it together. It was just fantastic. And when you're there, you think, this is a win-win-win-win-win solution. It's good for climate, it's good for biodiversity, it's good for mental health, it's good for physical health, it's good for the local economy, it's good for everything. And so many of the solutions that we're looking at really have that about them. And when we get climate change right and we come up with the right solutions, actually we can come up with things that have those kind of impacts. And they have this place, which I guess used to be the old farmhouse or something. They run it as a training centre to teach young people how to cook with vegetables, but it doesn't have like a kind of sort of Gordon Ramsay style sort of training kitchen with steel and glass and all that. It's just like a little cooker, a little cupboard, a fridge, and a shelf, because they said that's what most of these kids have in their homes, and then we teach them to cook in that setting. Fantastic. They have school groups coming through every day. It was the most wonderful, wonderful place. Everywhere should have something like that. Oh, no, you're not allowed to see those yet. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So, as I said, this evening is a kind of a love story in 9 what-if questions. So, this is our first what-if question. What if we took play seriously? So one of the things that really inspired me to start writing this book was I read some research done. So first of all, I kept reading people I really admire, like Naomi Klein and Bill McKibben, who kept saying, climate change is a failure of the imagination. And I'd think, that's really interesting. What do they mean by that? By which time they were off talking about something else, supergluing yourself to things and stuff like that. And I was still left going, that was really interesting, that failure of the imagination bit. Then I read some research that was done in 2011 by this researcher in America who took this thing called the Torrance test for creative thinking, the main kind of creativity test, very like the thing you did with a shoe. And they've done that going back to the 1960s in big groups of people. And her conclusion was that imagination and IQ rose together till the mid-90s, and then IQ kept rising, and imagination went into what she called a steady and persistent decline. When it was published, it was a really big story in America. It was on the front page of Newsweek. People said, what does this mean for economic growth? What does this mean for Hollywood? I don't really care about either of those. But what does that mean for climate change and social justice movements? That's really, really important. And I never heard it picked up by any of those people. Because if we're trying to help people to reimagine how we do things, the IPCC said we need to see rapid, far-reaching and urgent changes to all aspects of society. That's fundamentally a work of the imagination. And if our imagination isn't up to it, we're really in trouble. So one of the reasons, the first thing she said was we've seen a decline in play. Our streets used to be full of kids out playing. They would go out in the morning, come back when they were hungry, covered in mud, and they had their own culture of games and places and songs and stories and things that adults knew very, very little about. That has largely disappeared from our streets. It's been sort of scoured off the streets, and now we have a culture where we're expecting our children to start compiling their CV from the age of 4 as they're ferried from activity to activity to activity. But what was beautiful about that was how children learned to cooperate. It was how they learned to manage conflict, how they learned to take risks. And when you produce a generation of children who don't take risks, you produce a generation of adults who can't take risks. And that's the last kind of adults that we really need at this particular time. So I think there's something really, really precious about that culture, which is certainly in the global north has kind of all but disappeared. So when I was researching the book, I thought, where can I find a place where they're actually trying to bring play back again? So I went to Bristol, where they have this thing called Playing Out, which is this national project started in Bristol. In Bristol, there are 60 streets that close on a regular basis, organised by parents on the street. You need a couple of parents, you need a sign, it's quite simple. I went to visit this street in St George in Bristol. It's full of chalk drawings all over the pavement and kids on scooters and skipping ropes and all this kind of thing. I spoke to one of the mums who said, this isn't anti-car, it's pro-community. She said, all you have to do is get rid of the cars and this happens. It's there, but it has no space. You have to create the space for the play and for the imagination to happen. I spoke to lots of parents who said, since this came in, they could see the imaginative quality of the work their kids were producing was increasing. I spoke to one dad who said, well, after 6 months, we realised we actually quite liked each other. You actually saw the community reconnecting and people kind of finding each other again. It was really beautiful. In my town, in Totnes, we did a thing a couple of years ago called the Totnes Street Games Festival, where we took over the square, the Rutherfold at the top of town, closed it to traffic, and had a festival where kids came and learned to play games. For the first half, the parents stood around watching the kids play, and then the second half, the parents realised that they could play as well, and then the whole thing was just complete chaos. And we had people there who were refugees in the town who bought games from Pakistan and the places that they had come from. It was fantastic. My favourite game there was a Dutch game called Spekerpuppen, which is where you get a piece of string and you tie a nail onto it, so it dangles down kind of to about there. And then you have a bottle behind you on the ground, and you have to try and get the nail into the neck just by looking backwards through your legs like that. It's so brilliant. If any of you have kids or grandchildren, you think, their attention spans are all over the place, they just can't concentrate and they're so noisy, really. There was a girl doing this for about 10 minutes. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. It was fantastic. So that was brilliant. When you create the space for play, play happens. I was also really interested to see, well, where can I find places where people bring play back into politics? Oh no, actually, no, first of all, the thing with play is that increasingly play is something that we buy, or that we buy for our children rather than that we do with our children. Which allows me to introduce the hideous monstrosity that is Hello Barbie. And I bought Hello Barbie on eBay. She took a bit of looking for. And when I first bought her hair looked an awful lot nicer than it does now. She's been carted around in my bag quite a lot. So Hello Barbie was the first Wi-Fi enabled smart doll in the world. Hello Barbie has conversations with your child from a 218-page script written by Mattel. And then at the other end, then they record all of the child's answers. They call them dialogue chunks. And they use them to build a marketing profile of your child, which can then be bought and sold and traded with other companies. And so she took a bit of looking for, because what happened was that it was released in 2015, and almost straight away, an amazing American organization called the Campaign for a Commercial-Free Childhood launched a campaign called Hell No Barbie, which actually led to sales of this thing falling by about 90% in America. They're amazing. And their argument was, this kills your child's family of imaginary friends. You give your child a pile of sticks and some leaves, and they can turn it into anything. This does everything for you. It creates no space for the imagination at all. And what I really wanted to be able to do was to interview Hello Barbie live on stage in a sort of very in-depth dialogue about the erosion of imagination in young people's lives in our culture in 2019. I thought she might have a lot to say about it. But you can't do it anymore because the app has been discontinued. So we can't have, yeah. But then, but there was on the script. You can download the script that she spoke from. And my favourite bit from the script was, so now that we've been and used our imagination and played games, let's get serious and talk about something really important: fashion. Imagine letting your child anywhere near that. In Germany, they have a version of this called My Friend Kayla, which the German government classified as illegal espionage apparatus. So when the government starts classifying your children's toys as illegal espionage apparatus, then we're really in trouble. So I was really interested to see, well, where can I find people who are politicians who are re-embracing the idea of play and the role of play? And I heard about this amazing guy called Antanas Mokas, who was the mayor of Bogota. And he ran for office initially. He had been the president of the university, which was full at the time with very left-wing FARC rebel students who, whenever they tried to do an assembly, would just hurl abuse at him. So he first came to national prominence by trying to host a meeting, and it didn't really work because he couldn't make himself heard. So he turned around and mooned the whole hall, and later said, sometimes words just aren't enough. And it brought him to national prominence, so he ended up using that as a platform, amazingly. He lost his job, quite understandably. But then he ran to become the president of the mayor of Bogota, and he won. And he ran his campaign dressed as a superhero called Super Citizen, with a yellow cape and a big C on his chest. And one of the first things he did when he came in was in Bogota, they had the most corrupt traffic police in the whole country. So he and the highest levels of death on the road. So he sacked all of the traffic police department, and instead he hired 400 mime artists who came in and basically stood on all the intersections dressed as mime artists. They had red and yellow cards like football referees, and if cars misbehaved, they get shown a red card. He said that there's one thing people in Bogota fear more than more than traffic police, it's public humiliation. And the number of deaths fell on the road by 50%. And every major intersection had mime artists on it. I thought it was fantastic. And later on he said, here's what I've learned. People respond to humour and playfulness from politicians. It's the most powerful tool for change we have. My second what-if question. What if we considered imagination vital to our health? There's a really fascinating part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is kind of in the middle. It's sort of in two halves. It's shaped a bit like a sort of a wishing bone on a chicken. That's the place where your imagination and your memory kind of fire from. Imagination and memory are kind of almost the same thing, actually, in many ways. And but it's the part of the brain that is uniquely vulnerable to cortisol. So when we are anxious or traumatized or really stressed, the hippocampus shrinks. People who have post-traumatic stress disorder, often the hippocampus can be about 20% smaller than it would otherwise be. And what happens when the hippocampus shrinks is that we lose the ability to look at the future in positive and hopeful ways, and we kind of get stuck into the present or into the past. And we're living, I think, in an age where we are creating the perfect storm of conditions to cause the hippocampus to shrink. We're living in an age of anxiety. We have an epidemic of loneliness. And so we're kind of creating these situations where the hippocampus, I think, is our collective hippocampus is shrinking. So I was really interested to see, well, can I find a place where they are deliberately setting out to rebuild the hippocampus, a kind of campus for the hippocampus, if you like. And I went to Dundee to this amazing project called Art Angel. And at Art Angel, they're based on a first floor office block in Dundee. They work with people who have mental health problems or stress or burnout or whatever. And they say, when you walk through the door here, you're not a patient, you're not a client, you're an artist who is preparing work for an exhibition. And every year they put on an exhibition in the biggest art gallery in the centre of Dundee. There's tea, there's biscuits, there's all the materials you need, there's all the support you need. It was fantastic. And the people there knew I was coming and were happy to tell me their stories. And I spoke to one woman, she said, I spent the last 4 years in my pyjamas. She said, 6 months ago I came that close to taking my own life, even though I have 2 beautiful small children. She said, but I've been coming here for 6 months and now I can see the future again. It was really, really powerful. She said, now I'm thinking I might do this, and I might do that, and I'm going to paint my house like this. And she said, 6 months ago, I just absolutely could not see any of that at all. I spoke to one guy who'd worked in the local government for 30 years before he got really burnt out and had very low self-esteem. I said, so do you think of yourself as an artist? And he paused, and he said, aye, why not? You could see people kind of reimagining themselves and what their role was in the world. It was really, really beautiful, very kind of powerful to see. So I think there's something really important about how we create the best conditions in which the imagination can flourish and the imagination can come back. What if we followed nature's lead? These are all the chapters of the book, by the way. There's a link to the book. So what if we followed nature's lead? So, most of the great imaginative people in history drew a lot of that imagination from time in nature, but we spend less and less and less time outdoors, less and less time in nature. We also know that actually the more diverse the world around us is, that's so much better for our imagination. But we're living in a time where during my lifetime, the number of creatures we've shared this planet with has fallen by over 60%. 60%. So it's sort of the 6th great mass extinction or whatever. We're seeing this decline around us. And René Debow, the microbiologist, used to say, if we lived on the moon, our imagination would be as barren as the moon. So as we see that diversity around us shrinking, I think that has a real knock-on in terms of our imagination and our ability to be really imaginative. So again, I was really interested to see, well, where can I find people who are seeing nature as the way back into reconnecting people with imagination again? I heard about an amazing project in London called London National Park City, which was started by a guy called Daniel Raven Ellison, who's a geographer. And Daniel Raven Ellison took his son to visit all the national parks in the UK, and then he came back, and being a geographer, he made a map of London just showing the green and the blue bits. Not the roads, not the bridges, not the car parks, just the rivers, the lakes, the gardens, the parks, everything. He realised that 49.5% of London was green space and blue space. So he said, if we could make just another 0.5% of London green and blue space, which is 1 square metre for every person in London, then the majority of London would be green and blue space, so it could be a national park. Beautiful, and it's a beautiful what-if question. We'll talk more about what-if questions in a bit, but it's such a powerful what-if question. What if London was a national park? And the whole movement has been based around what-if questions. They say things like, what if the rivers were so clean in London you could swim to work? What if the bird song was so loud it drowned out the traffic? What if there were more trees than people in London? Beautiful, beautiful. And in July, Sadiq Khan declared London a national park city. And now there's all kinds of things happening all across the city. When they launched it, they didn't have one big launch, they did a decentralized launch. They said you can have a launch in your garden, you can have a launch on your window box, you can have a launch in your wherever you want to do a launch. It's a really beautiful project. And then the other person I spoke to was one of my great sheroes, a woman called Daria Robinson in Richmond in California, which is a tough, tough place in the shadow of a big Chevron oil refinery, really sort of impoverished place, lots of gangs and related problems. And she has, for the last 15 years, been running this amazing project called Urban Tilth. And Urban Tilth works with young people and teaches them how to grow food. And they've started 13 farms and market gardens throughout Richmond with an aim of producing 5% of Richmond's food, and they're just phenomenal. About 8 years ago, the Chevron oil refinery exploded because Chevron didn't want to spend $30 replacing one pipe. The sky turned black. Everything was covered in this sort of petroleum black kind of grot. And all these young people who had spent ages growing that year's harvest of food that was nearly ready were so incensed that when Chevron did a big public meeting to say, oops, sorry, they marched with all of their food and piled it up on the stage in front of these people while they were speaking. A very incredible project. But I said to her, you've been running this for 15 years. You've got 15 years worth of young people coming through this project, learning, connecting with soil, connecting with place, learning how to grow food. How have you seen that change the imagination of this place? And she said to me that when she was growing up there, everybody wanted to get out. She said everybody wanted to leave. Now I hear people saying, I want to live here. I want to be able to afford to buy a house and make my life here. And they're dreaming out all kinds of other new things and feeling like it's totally within the realm of possibility. They can be their own community developers. They can start these different businesses. There's a lot more people getting involved in politics. There's a lot more people with imaginative ideas. They want to start things like new non-profits and other things starting up. So whether we bring nature to where people are or take people to nature is a vital ingredient of rebuilding our collective imagination. What if we fought back to reclaim our attention? There's such an important link between attention and imagination. And I always try to imagine Vincent van Gogh in 1888 in the Yellow House in Arles, just before Paul Gauguin arrived to meet him. And Vincent van Gogh comes into the kitchen carrying a big, beautiful bunch of sunflowers, and he arranges them on a little wooden table in this lovely earthenware pot. And he sits back on his little wicker chair to look at them as the sun comes in through the window. And then he thinks, oh, I'll just check my Instagram page, and my Facebook page, and my Twitter, and my email. And then 2 hours later, he's watching videos of skateboarders falling downstairs and can't remember why he even wanted to look at videos of skateboarders falling downstairs. We wouldn't have that painting, that series of paintings, and how that has inspired and touched people down through decades. That sort of distilled concentration and observation and beauty, which can only come when you're actually able to sustain your attention span. But we live in a time where our attention span is under an unprecedented assault from many different directions. These are highly addictive devices we carry around in our pockets, which prey on our attention, and behind them are people who value our attention much, much more than we do. And there's a guy called James Williams wrote a book where he said, think about in your own life the things you want to achieve in the next 5 years. What are your goals? I want to do a study, I want to study something, I want to write a book, I want to travel, I want to start a family. There are things we have mapped out for the next 5 years in our life. What do you think the aim of the social media platforms we use every day are for our next 5 years? They're not the same as that. They're that you will, over that time, dedicate as much of your attention and time to that platform as you possibly can, because they value it far, far more than we do. And so reclaiming our attention and having the headspace and the attention span to be able to do everything that climate change demands of us is really important. I interviewed a guy called Dr. Larry Rosen, who's a neuroscientist, who studies the impacts of smartphones on our attention span. On this very torn piece of paper, hopefully I can read it over the crease. He said, imagination is taking ideas from other places in your brain, things you've heard, things you've done, things you've seen, and putting them all together in unique but valuable ways. We don't have the attention span to do that anymore, and it's not just young people. I would say that our attention is on the decline, our imagination is on the decline, exactly in the opposite trend of our time spent on smartphones. What if school nurtured young imaginations? What if we had an education system that people left at 18 with their imagination honed like a superpower, where anything felt possible? Where you left, I remember when they had the first school strikes in Australia, and the Prime Minister of Australia said, kids should be in school. Schools shouldn't be parliaments. I thought schools, that's exactly what schools should be, actually. You know, schools should be a living example of living and practicing democracy every day. Two of my kids went to a school near Totnes called Sands, where actually the kids, it's a democratic school, the kids can hire and fire teachers and could even vote to shut the school down if they wanted to. Not that they do, but they could if they wanted to. So I was really fascinated to find out, well, where are there schools that are really putting imagination at the fore of what they're doing? And all the schools that I spoke to about this talked about one particular place in Italy called Reggio Emilia. And Reggio Emilia was a place where in 1945, at the end of the war, all they had left was a tank, 3 trucks and 6 horses that the Germans left as they retreated north. And they sold those things to build a school, based on the idea of how can we create a school that will ensure that fascism never happens again. And fundamental to the idea is that in every school they have what they call an atelier, a workshop at the heart of the school, where you can go at any time of day and someone will help you make whatever you want to make. So making is fundamentally at the heart of what they do. They talk about the school itself as being the third teacher, that the space itself should be light and full of plants and full of laughter and food being made, and that the building itself is as important as what happens. They don't teach in subjects, they teach in projects. The kids work out the projects they want to do, and the school is there to support them. I've written quite a lot of things in different books about climate change, and I have to say this, researching that chapter about the state of health of the imagination in our education system in this country in 2019 was quite possibly one of the most heartbreaking things I've had to do. You know, we've seen a 20% decline in art teachers in the last 9 years in this country, 35% decline in the number of kids taking art subjects at GCSE, with the rise of the English baccalaureate, which pushes the arts out completely. You know, there are many teachers who think actually that the end of the arts is coming in our education system, unless you go to private school, in which case they have great art resources and theatre, because they recognise it as being part of how you build rounded people. But in the state sector, it's kind of being edged out of the picture entirely. And which is ridiculous, because in this country 20% of our economy in this country is what they call the creative industries, designers, filmmakers, imaginative people, which is bigger than aviation, aerospace, automotive making, the life sciences, and everything else put together. It's huge, and yet we sort of somehow think that that's just going to happen by magic, and it increasingly becomes the preserve of the privileged who can afford to go to art school. So so education is a really, really important part of this. And what if we became the best storytellers we could possibly be? What if those visions that you saw at the beginning when we went into the future were something that you became really brilliant at talking about and sharing with other people? That every conversation we had about climate change and the profoundly terrifying possibility that lies ahead of us of where the current trends were going, if we were able to weave into that story, but actually we could also create something utterly extraordinary. And how do we weave those stories, and how do we become the best storytellers of that we could possibly be? So two of the most interesting people that I interviewed were researchers at Plymouth University called Jackie Andrade and John May. And they developed something called functional imagery training, which is where they get people who want to change something in their life, maybe they're overweight or they have addiction issues or something, to help them to imagine in a kind of multi-sensory way what it would be like if they had made those changes. What would it feel like to be out running and to feel the kind of the sun on your skin and the bird song as you run underneath the trees? What would it feel like when you step out of the shower having exercise and all the endorphins and you feel fantastic? Really, really to imagine that with all of your imaginary senses. And what they find is that people make those changes and then they stick with those changes, because what they say is it gives people a new North Star. They call it creating memories of the future. that people make the changes and then they stick to those changes because it kind of becomes the new normal in their way of thinking, and it feels so kind of appropriate in terms of climate change. And the guy James Mackay, who drew those beautiful drawings at the beginning, he does this thing where he goes out in Leeds with an easel and he sets up an easel by the side of the street and he just starts to draw what he sees in front of him in Leeds. And as people walk by, he says, "Excuse me, how do you think this place could look in the future?" And they say, "Oh, I think it would have more bicycles and more trees." And so he starts to draw the trees and the bicycles. Stops somebody else, "How do you think this place could be?" "Oh, okay." And he just draws these sort of crowdsourced pictures of how the future could be. It's fantastic. And he says, all you need is a really simple sketch to start that conversation. It really doesn't take much. But it doesn't always need something as literal as that. Sometimes we can start to weave together what the future might be like through what it would feel like. And the arts are so beautiful for giving us a sense of that. So now I can show you those pictures you've already seen twice. So Quentin Blake, who is my favourite artist in the whole world, and who wrote an endorsement on the book, which was the proudest moment of my entire life. Since I was 7 and I saw him on the television, he used to do a programme where he would have a big white wall and a pen and he'd say, "There was a boy and his name was Jack and he lived in a house up on top of a hill." And I was like, "Oh, I love that, that's so brilliant." And he was commissioned by a maternity hospital in Angers in France to do a series of murals along the corridors as women arrived into the maternity hospital. He calls them a celebration of what's going to happen and a reassurance that that's what's going to happen. And I'm just going to show you 3 of those. Aren't they beautiful? You know, they don't set out a whole complicated, it's going to be like this, it's going to be like this. Actually, it gives you just a feeling of what it would be like if you got there. He tells a story about how when he'd done half of them, he was invited into a meeting with this rather fearsome administrator guy in the hospital. He thought, "Oh my God, he's going to tell us the budget's all gone and we can't do it anymore." And this guy said, "What's most important is the exchange of looks between the mother and the child," which I think really comes across there. This guy is called Per Gronqvist, and he was appointed recently by the Swedish government as chief storyteller. His job in the Swedish government administration is to be the chief storyteller, and his job description is to communicate the realities of day-to-day living in a carbon-neutral world. What a great job. And he said of that, he said, "My job is helping people to emotionally connect. When they emotionally connect with an issue, then they engage." So there's something really powerful about storytelling and how it enables us to connect emotions to these things. So, the last thing we're going to do together is that we're going to create a story. And what's lovely about the imagination, and particularly in relation to climate change, is the imagination thrives when it has limits. If I said to Mike, "Tell me a story," just tell me a story. You'd be, it would take you a while to think of a story. If I said, "Tell me a story about the mouse that lives under the piano in the pub round the corner," you've got a framing around the story. You've got limits around it. It's why haikus or limericks, or why Dr. Seuss writing a book with 50 words really flourishes. And I see it again and again, that when I visit communities who are thinking, "Okay, we need to cut carbon emissions by this amount, by that time get to zero carbon 2030. Okay, so what do we do?" Those limits really fire the imagination. So we're going to tell a story together based on your suggestions, and the limitation we're going to use is the alphabet. Okay, so we're going to kind of crowdsource, and we're going to tell the story about somebody who started doing transition, and it's going to be based on your suggestions. Okay, so the hero of our story is called Andrew. Okay, so Andrew. So where did Andrew live? Andrew came from somewhere around here. Bruton. Andrew came from Bruton. Okay, and what was Andrew's job in Bruton? What did he do? He was a carpenter. Okay, and as well as being a carpenter, when he wasn't being a carpenter, he was particularly kind of obsessed with something. There was something in his life he was obsessed with. Drinking or ducks? What would you rather have, drinking or ducks? Ducks. Okay, ducks have it. Okay, so he was kind of, his house was full of ducks of all different types, alive and stuffed and toy and everything. And so one day he was walking down the street in Bruton, and he bumped into somebody, and this other character was called Elizabeth. Very nice. So he met Elizabeth, and what did Elizabeth do? She was a fig wife. A midwife. No, we're on F. We're on F. Okay. A farmer. Okay, so she was a farmer. What was he again? He was a carpenter. Very good. See, this all goes straight out of my head. So you have to try and remember this one. Okay, so she was a farmer, and what was her thing that she was kind of particularly obsessed about? Goats. Okay, so there's definitely an animal theme emerging here. So, and there was also something they were both interested in, a joint kind of a thing. Happiness. They had both been looking for happiness for so long. And they found it there on Bruton High Street when they met each other. And they decided that they were going to create an event. They were going to do something. Something needs to change in Bruton. We need to make Bruton a happier place. Happiness is really important. How are we going to do this? We need to call a big event. We need to get everybody together. We're going to make big posters, put them all around Bruton with one word on across the top that starts with the letter I, and that word was? Ice cream! Well, if that's what fills a hole in Bruton, that's all right with that. So, ice cream in big letters, and underneath there was a little sentence started with J. Join us. Ice cream, join us. Beautiful. They put these posters all around Bruton. Nobody could miss them wherever they went. And on the eve, they thought, well, is anyone going to come? No one's going to come to our little soiree. Anyway, on the night it was absolutely packed. The whole venue, they couldn't believe it. They were so delighted. They ran an event to get people's ideas. They did it like open space. They got all different kinds of ideas. And one of the main ideas that came out was to create something in Bruton that starts with a K. Knickers. Knickerbocker glories. So they were going to restart the traditional Bruton knicker manufacturing industry. They were going to bring the knickers back to Bruton. And so there was a group who came together. They said, we're going to do this. And then that inspired other things that started with L, that started around that. Lingerie. There was a whole lingerie thing that kind of kicked off. Anything else that started with M alongside that? Keep it clean, it's a family show. M, we're on to M. Which? Mittens. There's definitely a clothing kind of a theme going on here. And anything else? Something started with N, they also got fired off. Because what started to happen was the knickers inspired the mittens, and then people started to feel inspired by the mittens and felt that whatever the thing was we just said with N was then became nightwear, started, and then that emboldened people, and then they felt actually we could start something starting with O. An orchestra. An orchestra. Bruton didn't know what had hit it. This had all kicked off within just a few months of their open space. There was orchestra, the lingerie, the mittens. It was really just going completely mad. And at that time, the local newspapers started to notice something was going on in Bruton. They ran a headline that started with P, just one word. What was it?
Please tell us what's going on.
Please tell us what's going on. We have no idea. The tectonic plates deep under the feet of Bruton are shifting in weird and exotic and wonderful ways. And then that inspired the local government. The government of this area thought, people are doing stuff here. People have got up off their arse and are doing something. This is really exciting to see. And so they decided to start a project starting with a Q. A Quago. What's a Quago? A Quango. No, they're not allowed Quangos in. A Queer Bruton. Yes. Very good. Very good. So that happened. And then at this stage... At this stage, Andrew and Elizabeth, was that right? That was it? Thank God. Andrew and Elizabeth paused for a bit of a reflection. They'd been working really hard for 5 years. They'd been supporting all of this lingerie and mittens and all these orchestras and everything and this shift. And they sat down with each other and they said, oh, God, how are you doing, Elizabeth? How are you feeling at this point? So Elizabeth said, I'm feeling... I shudder to think where this is going to go. So Andrew said, Elizabeth, how are you feeling? Starting with R. Relax. Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much. And she said to him, how are you feeling? Starting with S. Satisfied. Very good. Thank you. Very good. So then they decided, actually, we've facilitated this, we've held this space, people have done all this amazing stuff, it's been beautiful. But actually, maybe we should do a project with the two of us, like bring our pet interests of ducks and goats together and create a project that starts with a T. That is a transition. That's not necessarily picking up on the goat and duck sort of a thing. Is there something they could do that brought those two things together? A town zoo. Okay, but a kind of a new, kind of a free sort of a zoo, a sort of transition zoo. Yeah, so they started that and then they were very happy. And actually, as word spread about Bruton, because this story had legs, it went all around the world, Bruton, and it became known as Bruton, the town of, something starting with U. Utopia, or underwear. I suppose it could be any of those things. And then there was a survey done of all the young people in the town, and they said, what's the most popular activity now among young people that starts with a V? With a V. Volleyball. Volunteering. Very good. Very good. And just at this point, Andrew was walking down the high street in Bruton and he bumped into his ex. And his ex said, why? That's really the only way to get through that last bit. We'll be here all night otherwise. Anyway, and so then, after 5 years of all of this happening, the local town decided to celebrate Andrew and Elizabeth's hard work in transforming the town of Bruton, and they put up a statue and a plaque on plinth, and on top of it they put an object that starts with a Z that really captured and symbolised what had happened in the town. It was a zebra. I've no idea why. It was very symbolic. People didn't. It was a kind of an art thing. Anyway, so well done. Thank you for your beautiful story creating. So it's probably not going to look like that, but you never know. But the really important thing, it feels to me, is that we actually start telling stories of when people start to do this kind of thing and what it looks like when ordinary people step up and start to make change happen. So, what if we started asking better questions? I think one of the great things we need to master over the next few years is the art of asking really great what-if questions. So I want to just tell you 3 stories of great what-if questions. In Tooting, in London, a part of London with a big busy street and shops either side, in Tooting there's nowhere that's like a village square, a village green or a town square or sort of a people's place. There's one place it could be, which is a bus turning circle, which is normally full of buses with their engines idling, and the air quality is awful, and the people who live around it, the air is just appalling. So Transition Tooting said, I did a day called the Tooting Twirl, where they said, what if that was our village green? And they turned it into a village green for the day, and they bought turf, and they laid turf down on the tarmac. They bought flowers and coffee being made and music and carnival, and they filled that space with colour and music. It was just glorious. And I spent the whole day there. And as the day went on, the conversations around me changed. They started with, if this was our village green, to, when this is our village green. So interesting. It's like the permission underneath started to shift and started to change. It was just glorious. And there was a wall nearby that was a big wall of Primark that you would normally never ever look at, the most boring wall in the whole of London. And people, I heard them saying, when this is our village green, what are we going to paint on that wall? What story about ourselves do we want to paint on that wall? It was beautiful. Something really profound underneath started to change by them asking that what if question. In London, in Waltham, I forgot what's it called now. Yeah, Walthamstow in London. There's a couple called Hilary Powell and Dan Edelstein. He's a filmmaker, she's a printmaker, amazing printmaker. And they were really upset by seeing the impact of austerity on that community and the rise in debt and the rise of poverty. And so they, rather than thinking, let's start a petition or something like that, they took over the last bank on their high street that had just closed, the old cooperative bank. They took it over and they turned it into what they called an act of citizen money creation. And they turned it into where they started printing these notes. These are not a local currency. These are kind of collectible artworks, all of which are signed on one side. They're screen printed, block printed, gold foiled. And each of them has the face of somebody who is a hero in that community, who is catching the people who are falling through the holes created by austerity. So this is Tracy, who is the head teacher at the local primary school, who've lost all of their funding for the arts. Every penny. They can't run any arts whatsoever within that school. This is Sarah, who with her family, who are in the picture as well, run a project where they feed 200 people 2 meals a day, which they fund through fundraising and through their own resources. And Well, when I went to visit the bank, all the notes, they print them and they're all hanging like washing on a washing line, drying. And I met Sarah, who was gold foiling the notes with her own face on. And I said, what's it feel like to have your face on these notes? She said, for us, it's like Christmas. It's really beautiful. These are the two Steves who run a project keeping young men out of gangs. And this is Gary, who mortgaged his own house in order to turn his garage into a food bank because he could see that the need was so great. The bank then was open one night a week through the whole period as a place for talks and films about economics, as a sort of community learning space about economics. They also printed these bonds. You could buy bonds issued by what they call the Hoe Street Central Bank, SCB, with these beautiful bonds. So the idea was they wanted to sell £50,000 worth of these notes, which they did. And school groups came, and it was a real buzzing place. It was wonderful. So when they'd raised this, the half of that money was then distributed among those 4 charities. The really, really smart bit was they then took the other half, the other £25,000, to the secondary debt market, which is a whole world that we don't know very much about. But if Mike had a debt of £100 that he said, I'm not going to pay it back, for a year they would chase him, and then they'd give up, and they would sell it for as little as £2 to another company, who would then come after Mike again, a lot less pleasantly than the first company did. If he still didn't pay it, it would be sold on to another company, maybe for 50p, and they still come after Mike as if he owes them £100. But you can go to that market and you can buy back debt. So they bought £1.2 million worth of Wandsworth payday lending debt. And then they wrote to all those people a letter that said, you know that debt you had, just to say we've paid it off, you don't need to worry about it, good luck, have a good life. But by the way, if you'd like to join us on the 9th of May at this site overlooking Canary Wharf at 9 o'clock in the morning, you'd be very welcome. So when people turned up, there was a transit van that had been painted gold with debt in transit written on the side, that was filled with bits of paper with the word debt written on it. And at 10 o'clock in the morning, they blew the van up. They call it the detonation. And it's kind of the climax of the film that they're making. The really lovely bit was then that all the people who had bought more than £50 worth of bonds, of which I was one, then a few weeks later got sent in the post these little commemorative little bits of the van. They picked up every single piece of that van, and you got little bits of the metal like this, like presented like artworks, or you got a little bit of the windscreen. And then they also then melted down all the metal and minted commemorative coins. They're now trying to buy the bank building and actually own it as a community asset. But for me, what was so beautiful about it was, if you're moved by an issue, what they could have done, they could have made a petition and made a blog about debt. Or they could take over the bank, fill it with printers, fill it with printmaking. They said people would come into that building and go, this is what my dad used to smell like when he came home from work. They said people who were graphic designers would come in and go, oh, yes, I can actually make things. I spend all my time in front of a computer. They said people seemed starved of making. It was such a powerful experience for so many people. And then you blow a van up and then you make coins out of the metal. You know, we can do activism in a way so underpinned by imagination. The last what-if story is from Liège in Belgium. So in Liège in Belgium, I went there 5 years ago, Liège en Transition, really great transition group. They'd started a project called Ceinture Alimentaire, which means food belt, where they said, what if in a generation's time, the majority of the food eaten in this city came from the land closest to this city? It's just a beautiful what-if question, really invitational. Invited so many people to step in and say, I've got a piece of that, I've got a piece of that. I went to the event where they launched it. There were chefs and farmers and academics and baristas and anyone who cared about food at this event. It was amazing. And then I went home. I didn't really hear anything for 4 years. I went back last April, and in that time, they'd started 21 new cooperatives. They'd raised €5 million of investment from local people. I spoke to one guy who was part of a vineyard called Vin de Liège. They'd raised €2.5 million to start a cooperative vineyard. I said, how did you do that? And he looked at me kind of puzzled and said, it's Belgium. People like wine. People have some money. Don't be afraid. So I passed that advice on to you from Liège, and it was amazing. So they have 2 farms, they have 2 vineyards, they have a brewery. I had to go and visit that. You know, we all have to make sacrifices for change. They started this shop in the middle of Liège called Les Petits Producteurs, the small producers, where they just have food from local farmers, telling the story of where it comes from, put the food out. After 6 months, it was doing so much better than their best case scenario. They opened a second, now they've opened a third. The first one has now doubled in size. I spoke to the guy who runs it, a guy called Pascal Hennen. I said, how far can this go? He said, I think by the time we have 12 of these shops, the supermarkets will start to fragilize. It's this beautiful word in French, fragiliser. We never have it in English, but it kind of really works as well. And I met the mayor of Liège who said 8 years ago we wanted to be a smart city, now we want to be a transition city. And we see our role as just being to remove all the obstacles to this happening. All the land we own around the city we're making available. They're now connecting up Ceinture-Monterre with the hospitals, with the schools, with where their food comes from. And you're starting to see a city reimagining how its food system works, but it starts with those 2 questions, what if? Those 2 words, what if? My penultimate what if question, possibly the most difficult one to imagine in Britain in 2019, what if our leaders prioritised the cultivation of imagination? What if we were led by people who said, actually no, rebuilding this country's imagination is really important? Every government that gets elected says, we have a national innovation strategy, but innovation and imagination are not the same thing. Innovation is something you do when your fundamental model works, okay? I always liken it to pizza. So pizza, you can innovate with pizza. You can change the kind of dough, you can change the kind of toppings, you can change the kinds of cheese or whatever, because pizza fundamentally works. Pizza is great and we all understand pizza. You can innovate with pizza. But neoliberal growth-based economics are not like pizza. When you have an economic model that is pushing you off the cliff of extinction at a huge pace, innovation is not really what you need anymore. You need imagination. You need to reimagine and rebuild. You need to cultivate the ability to to imagine. So where do we find people working in the political sphere who are doing that? How do we create the best conditions? If you want to look at places where they're creating democratic frameworks that invite imagination, you already live in one of them. Well done. Congratulations. Fantastic. Barcelona is a beautiful example as well of a place where they have neighborhood assemblies, of places where people are coming together as in communities in their neighborhoods and making recommendations about policy, which are then meaning that Barcelona is one of the most radical, interesting, imaginative cities in the world. If you want to see an economic framework that invites imagination, you look at what they're doing in Preston with the Preston model, where they have an economic model which is about circulating money as much as possible in the town, using the key anchor institutions like the hospitals, the universities, to drive a reimagining of the economy. I found this amazing woman in Mexico City called Gabriela Gomez Montt, who was hired by the mayor of Mexico City to create what was conceived of as a Ministry of Imagination, which sounds like something out of a Harry Potter book. But that's what they have there. And half of it is made up of urban planners and transport engineers, those kind of people. The other half is made up of filmmakers and poets and writers and artists. And together they kind of curate and look after the imaginative life of that city. And when I spoke to Gabriela, she said to me, imagination is not a luxury. We should not only... I can't even read my own typing. That's not good, is it? We should not only be thinking about building cities for the human body, but also for the human imagination. The more we distribute the capacity to imagine different futures, the better off we will be. I came across, with just 2 weeks to go before the deadline, an amazing thing in Bologna called the Civic Imagination Office. Beautiful, where the municipality noticed a decline in people being involved in democracy and being involved in politics. And someone came who wanted to paint the bench on their street a different colour and found they would have to go through 6 different government departments to get the permission to paint the bench a different colour. So they created the Civic Imagination Office, which sits between the municipality and the people and basically invites people's ideas, runs open space, visioning exercises. But the brilliant bit is that when people come up with ideas, they do what they create pacts. So if they do this, imagine many of us go to community consultation things where we write things on post-it notes and then we go home and they all get put in the bin and things carry on as usual. What happens there is that the good ideas that come through the municipality sit down with them and say, okay, how are we going to make that happen? What can you bring to make that happen? This is what we can bring. Can we create a pact? Okay, let's make a pact. In the last 5 years, they've made 500 pacts. in Bologna that range from making a garden on a street to taking over an old office block and turning it into a training centre for young people to become classical musicians. Beautiful. That whole idea that actually, you know, we put pacts at the heart of it. And it made me think, what would it be like if we had a National Imagination Act in this country? Some way of enshrining a right to an imaginative life. And if you had such a thing, you wouldn't be able to impose austerity on people, because the imposition of austerity has really been a war on the imagination. It's been a kind of a disimagination machine. You shut the libraries, you put so many people into an acute state of fight or flight that is deeply ruinous to the imagination. And if you had a National Imagination Act, you wouldn't be able to do that, because you would see that it was so toxic to the national imagination. So, thank you. So my very, very last what-if question is, what if all of this came to pass? What would it be like to live in a time when anything felt possible and when the imagination ran riot? What would it be like if that was what the next 10 to 15 years felt like? This period of time we're about to go into. We could, in 2 weeks' time, have a government with a 2030 climate target and a Green New Deal and unlocking all kinds of different things. It would feel like the sense of possibility would be so different, I think. And that's really kind of what we've been trying to do in the transition movement, I think, is to bring that future that we dreamt at the beginning into the present in small ways, like starting a seed bank or starting to plant trees around where people live, to bigger projects like co-housing projects or big economic reimagining projects, to big like community energy projects like in Bath, where the Bath and West Community Energy has raised £17 million now from local people to invest in renewable energy there in the city. You know, these are the things that give people now a taste and experience of what that could be like. And in Crystal Palace in London, Transition Crystal Palace started a food market, and it won all of the awards for the best new market in London. And when I said to them, why do you do this? Why did you start this market? And why do you give so much of your time and effort to running this market? They said, because we want our children to grow up thinking that this is normal. And so much of the work that we do, and so much of the work that many of you do here, is about taking that future that we all can sort of see ahead of us as being so possible and rich with longing, that actually how do we bring it now into the future and give people a taste of it right now in the world that we live in. So just to sort of sum up, if I was to say, what are 4 things that we can do that really help us to bring the imagination out of, create the best conditions for a re-flourishing of the imagination? Imagination needs space. We all see it in our own life. When our lives are full, when we're stressed, when we have no space, we can't be imaginative. Those things like a universal basic income, a 4-day week, employers creating, even in our groups, creating space for dreaming within our groups and organisations makes such a difference. Having places where people can come together, where imagination is invited. Having practices that we can do together, like that exercise we did at the beginning, and many, many others that invite our imagination and really bring that out. And then the last one is pacts. Having ways that when we create those imaginative spaces, those things can happen. In my town, we have a project called Atmos, where the community is taking over and will be rebuilding a big old milk factory site next to the train station. The consultation for that, 5,500 people in a town of 8,500 people came and were invited to bring their ideas to shape and design what happened there, and that was what shaped it, and people felt so kind of respected and honoured in being part of that. So that's kind of, yes, hang on. So I just want to finish with a quote, which is my favourite quote out of the book, and then we're going to have some questions and things. So this is the quote that opens the book by Neil Gaiman, who many of you will have heard of, the author. He says, "We all adults and children have an obligation to daydream. We have an obligation to imagine. It's easy to pretend that nobody can change anything, that we're in a world in which society is huge and the individual is less than nothing, an atom in a wall, a grain of rice in a rice field. But the truth is, individuals change their world over and over. Individuals make the future, and they do it by imagining things can be different." Thank you so much.